He swore he wasn't the father and walked away, but 5 years later on a billionaire's yacht, he saw 3 little girls with his eyes. Adam Caldwell had grown used to the idea that the world bent to his will, a belief forged from years of climbing higher and higher until he stood at the top of the corporate ladder with a fortune that seemed limitless. From the outside, he appeared untouchable, the picture of success with his tailored suits, cold blue eyes, and the confident smirk that rarely left his lips. Investors admired him, rivals envied him, and newspapers hailed him as a genius of his generation. But behind that perfect image lay a man who had learned to armor himself with cynicism, convinced that emotions and vulnerability were nothing but weaknesses. He had spent his whole life building an empire that he believed would protect him from loss, yet in doing so, he left no room for love. Rachel had once pierced that armor. She was nothing like the women who flocked to him because of his name or his wealth. Her brown hair framed a face alive with warmth, and her brown eyes carried an honesty that left him disarmed. She laughed easily, argued fiercely, and refused to be impressed by money. Against his better judgment, Adam had fallen for her. With her, he allowed himself rare glimpses of what it meant to be human, to share evenings full of laughter instead of silence, to see beyond the cold walls of his office. Yet when she told him she was pregnant, every fear he had buried came roaring back. In that single moment, he saw not the chance to build a family but a threat to everything he had created. The night she told him, he sat in his penthouse staring out at the glittering city below, trying to make sense of emotions that scared him more than failure ever had. Rachel stood across from him, vulnerable but unyielding, and she pleaded with him to see what this meant, to choose love over fear. Instead, he hardened. With a cruel finality he told her that he wasn't the father, that whatever she carried had nothing to do with him. His words were sharp, meant to sever ties completely, and when she gasped in disbelief, he turned his back and walked away. He told himself it was the right choice, that a family would ruin him, that attachment would strip him of the control he had spent years building. But deep down, beneath the layers of pride, something in him cracked even as he slammed the door on her. Rachel left that night carrying not just the weight of her unborn children but the shattering realization that the man she had loved was far weaker than she had believed. Adam threw himself back into work, burying every thought of her beneath deals, acquisitions, and the endless chase of more. Yet in the quiet hours, when the city lights dimmed and the silence pressed in, he found himself haunted by flashes of her face, the hurt in her eyes, and the echo of the words he had spoken. Still, he pushed it down, telling himself that regret was useless, that success would fill the void. What he could not know then was that his decision had set him on a path that would one day bring him to his knees. For while he built towers of glass and steel, Rachel was learning to survive without him. She would bring 3 lives into the world, children who carried pieces of both of them, children who would laugh and cry and grow without knowing their father. And though Adam convinced himself that he had walked away clean, the truth was that the past was not finished with him. It would return with a force he could never have anticipated, and when it did, the man who thought he had everything would realize he had nothing at all. Rachel's life changed completely after that night when Adam turned his back on her. She had walked out of his towering glass penthouse into the dark, rainy streets with nothing but her dignity, her unborn children, and the unbearable weight of rejection pressing down on her. For the first few days she moved like a shadow, staying with an old friend until she could gather the strength to stand on her own. She cried in the silence of the bathroom so no one would hear, her hands pressed against her belly as if to promise the lives growing inside her that she would never abandon them, no matter how alone she felt. She refused to let Adam's cold words define the future of her children. If he chose power and pride, she would choose sacrifice and resilience. Her body grew heavier as the months passed, and with each doctor's visit the truth became more overwhelming. She wasn't carrying 1 child, but 3. The news struck her like a thunderbolt. She had sat frozen in the sterile white office, staring at the ultrasound screen in disbelief as 3 tiny heartbeats flickered across it. Fear washed over her, but it was followed quickly by determination. 3 times the struggle meant 3 times the love, and she swore she would give everything she had to raise them. While Adam's name echoed in headlines about record-breaking deals and luxury acquisitions, Rachel was clipping coupons, working long shifts at a small bookstore, and sewing old clothes into tiny onesies at night by the faint light of a lamp. Every movement inside her reminded her of what she was fighting for. When the day of the birth arrived, it was chaos and pain and exhaustion beyond anything she had imagined. She had no family at her side, no partner holding her hand, only nurses who rushed about as if she were a stranger. But when she finally heard the first cries and saw the 3 tiny faces placed one by one into her arms, the void left by Adam's rejection no longer felt so devastating. Each girl had a head of soft brown hair and eyes that sparkled blue the moment they opened, eyes that mirrored the very man who had denied them. Rachel wept, overwhelmed not just by love but by the bittersweet ache of knowing Adam's presence was in them whether she wanted it or not. Still, she kissed each forehead and whispered promises that she would protect them, that she would never let them feel unwanted. The first years were brutal. Rachel lived in a small apartment with peeling paint and a broken heater, juggling bottles and midnight feedings with the demands of 2 jobs. She often fell asleep sitting upright, only to wake in panic when one of the girls cried out. There were days she didn't know how she would pay the rent, weeks when she skipped meals so her daughters could eat, and nights when her body shook with exhaustion so profound she thought it would break her. Yet every time she looked at them, 3 pairs of blue eyes staring back at her, she found the strength to keep going. Their laughter, their small hands clutching her fingers, the way they snuggled against her chest as if she were their entire world, gave her a sense of purpose she had never known. Rachel's friends told her she was strong, but inside she carried scars. She never spoke Adam's name, but she could never erase him completely either. He lingered in her daughters' faces, in their curious smiles and stubborn streaks, in the uncanny way they sometimes looked at her as if demanding answers she couldn't give. She told herself that one day she would tell them the truth, but for now she filled their world with love so they would never feel the absence of a father. She became both mother and father, nurse and teacher, comforter and protector. Her daughters grew up not in luxury but in a home filled with warmth, resilience, and the quiet triumph of survival. Still, late at night, when the girls were finally asleep and the apartment was silent except for the hum of the old refrigerator, Rachel sometimes allowed herself to imagine what might have been if Adam had chosen differently. She pictured him holding one of the babies, smiling in that rare unguarded way she had once seen, and then forced the thought away. She couldn't waste her life on a man who had already made his choice. He had turned his back and declared he wasn't a father, and she would not give him the satisfaction of knowing how wrong he had been. What she didn't know was that fate had a way of circling back, and the man who believed he had walked away forever would one day be forced to face the truth written in 3 pairs of blue eyes. Adam's life in the years that followed was outwardly gilded, the kind of existence most men would sell their souls to achieve. He became a regular presence in financial magazines, his face gracing covers with headlines that hailed him as a visionary leader who had turned a modest investment firm into a global empire. His days were carved into rigid schedules of board meetings, flights across continents, lavish galas, and endless negotiations. He had the penthouses, the fast cars, the tailored suits, and the kind of power that made doors open before he even thought to knock. People stood when he entered a room, investors clung to his every word, and rivals measured themselves against him with grudging respect. From the outside, Adam Caldwell was the embodiment of success, a man who had proven his place among the elite. But beneath the perfection, there was an emptiness that gnawed at him, a silence that lingered no matter how loud the applause. At first he told himself it was nothing more than fatigue, the price of ambition, but as the years passed the hollow spaces in his life grew harder to ignore. His penthouse, though filled with priceless art and panoramic views, was silent in a way that chilled him. He came home to empty rooms, poured himself expensive whiskey, and listened to the quiet hum of the city below, realizing there was no laughter, no warmth, nothing but sterile solitude. He had mistresses, fleeting companions who came and went, drawn to his wealth and influence, but none stayed long enough to leave an imprint. They were distractions, temporary bandages over wounds he refused to acknowledge. There were nights when he stood by his floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the lights of the city, and thought of Rachel. He remembered the warmth of her smile, the way she never bowed to his arrogance, the strength in her eyes when she challenged him. He also remembered the night she left, the sharp edge of his own words when he told her he wasn't the father. He told himself she had moved on, that whatever life she lived now had nothing to do with him, yet a part of him wondered. Did she keep the child? Did she marry someone else? Did she raise a family without him? He silenced these thoughts quickly, convincing himself that regret was weakness, but they always returned when he least expected them. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between meetings, he caught himself staring at the children of his colleagues, their innocent laughter echoing through his memory like an unwelcome ghost. He would watch a father ruffle his son's hair or lift his daughter onto his shoulders, and a sharp ache would pierce his chest before he could shove it away. He told himself he had no use for family, that love was a liability, yet the envy that flickered through him betrayed the lie. No matter how he tried to smother it, the emptiness was there, deep and persistent, growing louder as the years went by. Business became both his shield and his prison. He signed larger deals, expanded his company into new markets, and drowned himself in work, believing that the next victory would silence the hollow place inside him. But no victory lasted long. Every success felt fleeting, every celebration hollow. Even on the nights when he stood on the decks of luxury yachts, surrounded by champagne and laughter, he felt apart from it all, as though he were watching his life from behind glass. The higher he climbed, the more he realized how alone he was at the top. Adam rarely allowed anyone to see the cracks in his armor. To his board he was decisive and unyielding, to the media he was charming and ruthless, and to himself he was still the man who had chosen ambition over love. But in the depths of night, when the silence pressed in and the weight of his choices settled over him, he wondered if he had made the greatest mistake of his life. He didn't know that the truth of that mistake was still waiting for him, growing stronger every day, and that sooner than he imagined he would be forced to face the consequences of the night he walked away from Rachel and everything she carried. The invitation had come like so many others before it, embossed on heavy paper with golden lettering, promising exclusivity and indulgence. Adam barely paid attention when his assistant placed it on his desk, but out of habit he accepted, adding the yacht party in Monte Carlo to his already crowded calendar. He told himself it was just another networking opportunity, another evening of shallow conversations and polite smiles, but something about the event tugged at him. The Mediterranean was glittering that evening as he arrived, the kind of view that was supposed to impress him but instead only reminded him of how much he had stopped feeling. The yacht was massive, gleaming under strings of soft lights, its decks crowded with the wealthy and powerful. Music drifted through the air, the clink of champagne glasses blended with the hum of conversation, and beautiful people dressed in elegance moved about as though nothing in the world could touch them. Adam stepped into the gathering, commanding attention as he always did, his dark hair carefully styled, his eyes sharp and cold, his tailored suit the mark of a man who never settled for less than perfection. People greeted him, flattered him, and tried to draw him into discussions, but he moved through the crowd detached, nodding when required, offering half-hearted smiles, his mind already restless. He had wandered toward the upper deck, seeking a moment of quiet, when his eyes caught a figure at the railing. For a second, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, dredging up old ghosts. But then she turned slightly, and the breath left his chest. It was Rachel. She stood in the warm glow of the setting sun, her brown hair catching the light, her posture steady yet softened by something he could not place. And then he saw them, 3 little girls darting around her, their laughter carrying above the music, their tiny hands tugging at her dress as they pointed out the sea and the gulls overhead. Adam froze where he stood, his body rigid as though the world had shifted beneath his feet. The girls were unmistakable. Each one had soft brown hair, but their eyes were a piercing blue that mirrored his own, the same shade he saw in the mirror every morning. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. These were not strangers, not some distant possibility. They were his daughters. The daughters he had denied. The daughters he had abandoned without ever knowing. For a long moment he could not move. His hands trembled as he gripped the polished railing, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the music. He tried to reason with himself, to believe it was coincidence, but the evidence was undeniable. The curve of their smiles, the way one of the girls tilted her head in a gesture he had seen in photographs of himself as a boy, the identical shade of their eyes, all of it screamed the truth he had buried for years. He was their father. Rachel glanced up then, her eyes meeting his across the deck. For an instant the world went silent. The look she gave him was sharp, filled with recognition, but also with pain and fury that had been building for 5 long years. She did not flinch, did not look away, though her hand instinctively reached down to gather her daughters closer, as though she could shield them from the man who had once rejected their existence. Adam felt his throat close, words piling up that refused to escape. He wanted to go to her, to say something, anything, but his feet remained rooted to the spot. One of the girls, curious and unaware of the tension, turned toward him. She tilted her head, studying him with those blue eyes that seemed far too knowing for a child so young. She smiled, a simple, innocent gesture, and Adam felt the ground drop out beneath him. That smile, so free and unburdened, shattered the last defenses he had held. His eyes burned as tears he could not control blurred his vision. For the first time in his adult life, surrounded by the wealth and luxury he had always worshipped, he felt utterly ruined, not by failure in business but by the realization of what he had lost. He had told himself for years that he did not need love, that he did not need family, that cutting Rachel out had been the practical choice. Yet here, on a yacht surrounded by strangers, he understood the depth of his mistake. He had not simply walked away from Rachel. He had walked away from his own children, from 3 little girls who should have known their father's embrace from the moment they were born. And now, watching them laugh in the golden light of evening, he realized the truth he had denied for too long. He was not the man he thought he was, and everything he had built meant nothing compared to the sight of what he had abandoned. Adam stood there longer than he should have, caught between the impulse to step forward and the fear that if he did, Rachel would turn her back on him the way he once did to her. The laughter of the girls carried through the salt-tinged air, pure and unguarded, while the murmur of wealthy guests around him blurred into meaningless noise. He saw them twirling near the railing, chasing one another with ribbons Rachel must have tied into their hair, their dresses fluttering in the evening breeze. He thought of how he had once believed children would trap him, how he had convinced himself that fatherhood would be the end of his freedom. Yet nothing had ever made him feel as trapped as he did now, standing frozen, unable to claim them, unable to undo the past. At last, his body moved almost against his will, carrying him slowly toward them. His steps were unsteady, as if every pace across the polished deck chipped away at the carefully constructed armor he had worn for years. His mind raced with words he might say, but none seemed strong enough to bridge the canyon he had created. When he reached the edge of their circle, one of the little girls looked up again, the same one who had noticed him before. She blinked those piercing blue eyes at him and offered another small smile, hesitant yet open, and in that moment Adam's composure cracked completely. His throat tightened and tears, hot and unexpected, filled his vision. He quickly looked away, ashamed to be unraveling in front of strangers, but he could not stop the flood of emotion. Rachel noticed immediately. Her body stiffened, her protective instincts rising as she drew the children closer. The defiance in her eyes was the same as the night he had rejected her, but now there was more: 5 years of survival, 5 years of loneliness, 5 years of raising children without him. She stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and fury, her lips pressing into a thin line. The girls, unaware of the storm between their parents, tugged at her hands, asking innocent questions, giggling at nothing more than the seagulls overhead. Adam felt the weight of Rachel's stare, each second stretching longer, pressing him further into the truth of his own failings. He tried to speak then, but his voice betrayed him. The first word stumbled out as little more than a whisper, apologies half-formed, confessions that refused to line themselves into neat sentences. He told her he had been wrong, that he had been blind and arrogant, that fear had made him cruel. Each word was clumsy, inadequate, but he forced them out, desperate to reach her through the wall she had built. Rachel listened without answering, her face unreadable, but her silence was louder than any outburst could have been. Her daughters tugged at her dress, demanding attention, and she bent down to comfort them, deliberately turning away from Adam as if to remind him that he had no place there. He stood helpless, the noise of the party fading into insignificance around him, watching as she knelt among the 3 girls who bore his eyes. His heart broke at the sight of them leaning against her, safe in her arms, their small hands gripping her tightly. He realized that he had not only lost Rachel, he had lost the right to be their father, a role he had denied and abandoned before it had even begun. The grief of that realization was heavier than any business failure he had ever feared, and for the first time in his life, he envied no man more than he envied the father he could have been. Rachel finally rose, meeting his gaze one last time before guiding her daughters away across the deck. Adam remained where he was, motionless, feeling the hollow ache of absence grow sharper with each step she took. He could have followed, could have pleaded for another chance, but he knew the wound was too raw, the betrayal too deep. All he could do was stand there, tears streaking his face in full view of a world that had always seen him as unshakable, and understand that the empire he had built had cost him the only treasure that truly mattered. That night, as the yacht sailed under the stars and the party roared around him, Adam slipped into the shadows of the deck, consumed by a grief he had never known. He thought of the girls' smiles, of Rachel's protective arms, and the words he had spoken 5 years earlier. "I'm not the father." How wrong he had been, and how cruel. He now carried the crushing knowledge that he was indeed their father, and he had missed every moment that could never be relived. For the first time in his life, the man who had once believed he could control everything realized he had no control at all over the things that truly mattered. Adam left the yacht that night a broken man, the glittering lights of Monte Carlo blurring through his tears as if mocking him with their emptiness. He returned to his hotel suite, but the luxury surrounding him only felt suffocating. The marble floors, the endless view of the sea, the fine wines laid out for his enjoyment, it all seemed hollow compared to the sound of his daughter's laughter that still echoed in his mind. For hours he paced the room, replaying every second of the encounter, from Rachel's cold stare to the innocent smile of the little girl who had looked straight at him. He knew then that he could no longer bury the truth beneath work or wealth. Those children were his blood, and no matter how much Rachel despised him, he could not walk away a second time. The following morning, Adam made the decision that terrified him more than any hostile takeover or corporate battle. He would pursue them, not in the ruthless way he had pursued companies, but with patience, humility, and persistence. He had spent years telling himself that emotions weakened men, yet he now understood that the absence of emotion had weakened him far more. For the first time, he admitted that his empire meant nothing if he had no one to share it with. The challenge ahead was not about numbers or strategies but about proving to Rachel and the girls that he was capable of change, that the man who had turned his back 5 years ago no longer existed. His first attempts were clumsy. He asked contacts in Monaco discreetly where Rachel lived, but he quickly realized how wrong it felt to track her as though she were a business asset. He stopped himself, knowing that forcing his way into her life would only deepen her anger. Instead, he waited for opportunities that came naturally. He began appearing at community spaces where he knew families gathered, not to intrude but to catch glimpses of the girls, to see them run and play, to reassure himself that they were safe. Each time he saw them, his chest tightened with both pride and regret. They were growing quickly, their personalities already shining through, and he had missed every first word, every first step, every bedtime story. The pain of that loss was unbearable, but it also strengthened his resolve never to miss another moment if he could help it. Rachel noticed him more than once, her eyes flashing with anger whenever their paths crossed. Once, when he approached too closely at a small park, she gathered the girls and left without a word, her back stiff and unyielding. Adam wanted to call after her, to beg her not to shut him out, but he knew he had no right to demand anything. He returned home each time feeling defeated, but he reminded himself that this was his punishment, and that regaining her trust would take more than persistence. It would take proof, and proof required time. He began to change in ways that startled even himself. He turned down business trips that would have kept him away for weeks, something he had never done before. He stopped attending empty social gatherings that had once fed his ego. Instead, he poured his energy into small, quiet gestures. He donated anonymously to the local community center where Rachel often brought the girls, ensuring it had the resources to provide programs and activities they could enjoy. He arranged for a nearby clinic to expand its pediatric services, making sure Rachel and the children would never struggle to find care. He never attached his name to these efforts, never sought recognition, because this time it wasn't about power or influence. It was about giving back what he had once refused to give. At night, however, the doubts tormented him. He would sit alone in his vast apartment, staring at the photographs on his phone that he had secretly taken of the girls from a distance, never invasive, but small reminders of the lives he longed to be a part of. He wondered if they would ever call him father, if Rachel would ever look at him without bitterness, if redemption was truly possible. There were moments when despair threatened to swallow him, but then he would remember the way one of the girls had smiled at him on the yacht, a smile untainted by the past, and it gave him hope. One evening, as he walked through the marina where Rachel's modest home overlooked the water, he caught sight of her again. She was sitting on a bench, the 3 girls clustered around her, their laughter rising into the twilight. Adam kept his distance, but this time Rachel did not immediately rise to leave. Instead, she looked at him across the distance with an expression that was no longer pure fury but something more complicated, weariness, suspicion, and perhaps the faintest flicker of curiosity. For Adam, it was enough. It was a sign that the walls, though high and impenetrable, might one day begin to crack. He returned home that night with a determination unlike any he had ever known. For years he had fought battles in boardrooms and conquered markets, but none of those victories mattered anymore. The only battle worth fighting was for the trust of Rachel and the love of his daughters. It would not be quick, and it would not be easy, but for the first time, Adam embraced the idea that he did not need to win. It was enough to keep showing up, to keep proving himself, until the people he loved believed him. The turning point came quietly, without the drama Adam had expected, and that made it all the more powerful. For weeks he had been careful, keeping his distance, offering help in ways that Rachel could not refuse even if she wanted to, always conscious not to push too far too quickly. Then one Saturday morning, as Rachel sat on a bench near the park watching her daughters chase one another through the grass, Adam happened to be walking by. He would have kept going, as he had so many times before, but one of the girls tripped and fell, scraping her knee against the pavement. Her cry pierced the air, sharp and immediate, and without thinking Adam rushed forward. He knelt beside her, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to wipe away the tiny streak of blood, murmuring reassurances in a voice so soft it startled even him. Rachel's instinct was to protest, to tell him to leave them alone, but she stopped when she saw her daughter lean into him, comforted by his presence. The little girl looked up at him with wet eyes, and between sobs asked a question that shattered the fragile silence. "Are you my daddy?" The words hung in the air like a knife. Rachel stiffened, her heart pounding, while Adam froze, his breath caught in his throat. He had dreamed of this moment, dreaded it, and prayed for it all at once, but he had never imagined it would come so suddenly. He met Rachel's eyes, silently asking for permission, and for a moment she wanted to scream no, to protect her daughters from the man who had once abandoned them. But something in his expression, something raw and vulnerable, stopped her. She gave the faintest nod, almost imperceptible, and Adam turned back to the little girl with tears in his eyes. "Yes," he whispered, his voice breaking, "I'm your daddy." The child blinked at him, then smiled through her tears, throwing her arms around his neck with a trust that tore him apart inside. The other two girls, curious and unwilling to be left out, hurried over, their giggles replacing the earlier cries, and soon Adam found himself sitting in the grass surrounded by three small bodies climbing onto his lap, tugging at his sleeves, asking questions faster than he could answer. Rachel stood a few feet away, her arms folded, her face unreadable, but she did not pull them away. She simply watched, her heart caught between anger and something she dared not call hope. In the days that followed, the girls began to ask about him constantly. They wanted to know when they would see him again, if he would come to the park, if he could read them stories or bring them toys. Rachel resisted at first, insisting that he could not simply waltz into their lives after 5 years of silence, but the more she watched their excitement, the harder it became to deny them. She set conditions, strict and clear, and Adam agreed without hesitation. He would not take them anywhere alone, he would not disrupt their routines, and he would never, ever make promises he couldn't keep. For the first time in his life, Adam accepted rules that weren't his own, because he knew that if he wanted to be part of their world, he had to earn it on their terms. The girls, however, accepted him with a speed that stunned Rachel. They didn't remember the night he walked away, didn't carry the scars of rejection she bore. To them, he was simply their father, tall and strong, with the same blue eyes they saw in the mirror every morning. They reveled in his attention, clambering onto his shoulders, making him chase them until he was breathless, laughing when he pretended to be defeated. For Adam, every moment with them was both a gift and a punishment, a reminder of what he had missed and what he might still save. He cherished the way their hands fit into his, the sound of their voices calling him daddy, the way they curled against him when they grew tired, as if they had been waiting all their lives for this. Rachel's resistance began to falter, not because she forgave him, but because she could not ignore the joy in her daughters' faces. She saw Adam carrying them on his back, heard him laugh in a way she had never heard before, softer and freer than the polished charm he once wore like a mask. She noticed the way he listened to their endless stories as if nothing in the world mattered more, the way he knelt to their level to meet their eyes, the way he never once reached for his phone when he was with them. Slowly, she realized that the man she had known, the cold, arrogant CEO who had chosen ambition over love, was gone. In his place was someone who seemed to understand the weight of his mistakes and the value of what he had lost. One evening, as the sun set over the water, Rachel found herself sitting beside Adam while the girls ran ahead, their laughter echoing through the park. She hadn't planned to speak, but the words slipped out before she could stop them. "They love you." Her voice was quiet, almost bitter, but there was no denying the truth of it. Adam turned to her, his eyes filled with both gratitude and regret. "I love them more than I ever thought I could love anyone," he said, and the sincerity in his tone made her chest tighten. She looked away, unwilling to let him see the tears threatening her eyes, but deep inside she knew that something had shifted. Rachel still carried the wounds of his betrayal, and forgiveness was not something she could give easily. Yet as she watched her daughters laugh in the golden light, their blue eyes sparkling with joy, she felt the faintest stirrings of a possibility she had long since buried. Perhaps redemption was not a fantasy. Perhaps change was real. And though she wasn't ready to let him back into her heart, she could no longer deny that he was already a part of their lives, and that, whether she liked it or not, he belonged there. The months that followed were not easy, but they were different, marked by a slow transformation that none of them could have predicted. Adam became a regular presence in his daughters' lives, not as an intruder forcing his way in but as a steady figure who arrived when promised, who showed up not with lavish gifts but with patience and sincerity. He learned how to braid tiny ribbons into their hair, how to listen to their endless questions about the world, how to make them laugh by pretending to lose at games they had invented. With each passing day, he began to stitch himself into the fabric of their lives, careful not to pull too hard, careful not to undo the trust that was forming thread by thread. Rachel remained cautious, her heart a fortress built from years of betrayal and loneliness. She watched him with suspicion, expecting him to falter, waiting for the moment when his old self would reappear and remind her why she had hated him. Yet what she saw instead startled her. Adam no longer lived like the man she had once known. He cancelled meetings to spend afternoons at the park, he excused himself from galas and dinners to sit at the kitchen table coloring with the girls, and he spoke less of his empire and more of the simple things, school projects, bedtime routines, the joy of hearing his daughters call him daddy. His eyes, once cold and calculating, had softened, and though Rachel tried to deny it, she felt her resolve weakening. One rainy evening, as thunder rolled across the sky and the girls curled up with blankets on the sofa, Adam arrived at Rachel's door carrying a bag of groceries. She frowned, surprised by his casual presence, but before she could object, he explained that he had remembered her once mentioning how difficult stormy nights were for the children, and he thought a warm meal might help. Against her better judgment, she let him in, and together they prepared dinner in the small kitchen. The girls darted in and out, giggling, their chatter filling the silence that had once separated them. For the first time in years, Rachel felt the strange, almost unbearable familiarity of family life, and it both warmed and frightened her. As the storm raged outside, the girls eventually drifted to sleep, exhausted from excitement. Rachel found herself alone with Adam, the quiet between them heavy with words left unsaid. He broke it first, his voice low and trembling with vulnerability. He admitted that he had been afraid of love, that he had believed success would be enough to fill the emptiness inside him, but that seeing her again had destroyed the illusion. He confessed that he had hated himself every day for the words he had spoken, for denying his own children, and that he would spend the rest of his life proving to them, and to her, that he could be the man they deserved. His honesty, raw and unpolished, struck something deep within her that she had buried for years. Rachel wanted to resist, to remind him of the pain he had caused, but as she looked at him sitting there, his eyes wet with tears he made no effort to hide, she realized that this was not the same man who had once closed the door on her. This was someone humbled by loss, reshaped by regret, and softened by love. Slowly, cautiously, she allowed herself to speak the words she had sworn she never would. She told him that forgiveness would not be easy, that the scars he had left were deep, but that she had seen the way he loved their daughters, and she could no longer deny that he had changed. The days after that night brought more small steps. Adam continued to show up, not with promises of grandeur but with consistency, with quiet gestures that spoke louder than words. Rachel began to let him into conversations about school schedules, about medical appointments, about the little details of daily life that she had once shouldered alone. The girls, oblivious to the weight of what was happening, thrived in the presence of both their parents, their laughter brighter, their joy deeper. They had no understanding of the history between Adam and Rachel, only the certainty that they were loved. The final shift came one summer afternoon when the family was invited to another gathering on the same yacht where Adam had first seen them again. Rachel hesitated, memories pressing in, but she agreed for the sake of the girls. As they stood together on the deck, watching the sun set over the sea, Adam reached for her hand, uncertain and trembling. She did not pull away. Instead, she allowed their fingers to intertwine, a gesture so simple yet so profound that it felt like the closing of a wound and the opening of a new chapter. The girls danced around them, their laughter ringing across the water, and for the first time, Rachel felt a sense of peace where there had once been only pain. Adam knew that redemption was not something achieved in a single moment but something earned every day, in every choice and every action. He understood that Rachel's forgiveness was a fragile gift, one that required care and humility to preserve. But as he stood there, holding her hand, with his daughter's joy surrounding him, he realized that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. Not power, not wealth, not control, but family. And so, in the quiet glow of evening, the man who had once believed he would lose everything by loving her finally understood that it was love that gave him everything he had ever needed.